Hello, I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome to Outside Source. China is warning the UK over interference in Hong Kong and over questions about Huawei's role in UK telecoms.
If you want to make China a hostile country, you have to bear the consequences.
The Americas remain the coronavirus pandemic's epicenter. We're going to have reports from Brazil and elsewhere on the continent. And why does President Trump keep talking about postal voting? We'll look at why this has become a major political issue in the US. And the composer behind some of cinema's most iconic theme tunes, Ennio Morricone, has died. We'll be live in New York. Well, welcome to the first programme of the week. We're going to start in Hong Kong. It's been a week now since China imposed a controversial national security law, and today we actually got to see full details of the powers this gives Hong Kong's police. Here's NPR's Emily Fung reacting. In a week's time, Hong Kong has gone from this mainland-based reporter's dream to an operating environment designed to strike the fear of law into anyone who wants to mildly talk about dissent. Well, the authorities published details of these powers on Monday night. As you can see, there's a lot of detail. We've pulled out some of the main points for you. Under what it calls urgent circumstances, police can search a place without a warrant. Police under investigation can be prevented from leaving Hong Kong. If police consider what they call a message on an electronic platform is likely to endanger national security, they can ask the platform to remove it and ban the user. They can also ask the service provider to provide identification records or decryption assistance. Well, WhatsApp, Facebook, Telegram, Twitter and now Google have all said they've paused the processing of government requests for user data in Hong Kong. Here's one response, Facebook saying, "We have a global process for government requests, and in reviewing each individual request, we consider Facebook's policies, local laws and international human rights standards." Also, schools have been ordered to remove any books that don't comply with this national security law. Well, here's our China correspondent Stephen McDonnell reacting to all of this detail. He says, as is plain for everyone to see, the line from Beijing and Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam that Hong Kong's state security law would only impact a handful of violent extremists is on so many levels demonstrable nonsense. By all means defend the law, but don't lie, says Stephen. Well, in Hong Kong, pro-democracy activist Joshua Wong made this plea today.
With the risk of our personal safety, with the threat of life sentencing, we might be worried and also being targeted by Beijing. But we also encourage the global community to let our voice be heard in the world. Once we still have any possibility, we still hope to let the world to know that now is the time to stand with Hong Kong, and now is the time for Hong Kongers keep our momentum.
Well, in the last week, we've seen a lot of diplomatic to and fro as reaction to this law has played out. Last week, the UK offered several million Hong Kongers a path to British citizenship in a direct response to this new law. Today, the Chinese ambassador to Britain said this.
The UK government keeps making irresponsible remarks on Hong Kong affairs through its so-called 6-monthly report on Hong Kong, make unwarranted accusations against the national security law for Hong Kong SAR, and even talks about changing the arrangement for British national overseas passport holders in Hong Kong. These moves constitute a gross interference in China's internal affairs and openly trample on the basic norms governing international relations.
And here's the UK Foreign Secretary's response to that.
The real issue here is one of trust, and whether China can be trusted to live up to its international obligations and its international responsibilities. And that's a message that we're telegraphing, along with many of our allies and indeed many international partners around the world, to Beijing, particularly in relation to what we've seen in Hong Kong.
Well, Hong Kong isn't the only issue that's impacting UK-China relations. The UK's decision to allow the Chinese telecoms firm Huawei to be involved in its 5G network is being reconsidered. Here's Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
I'm very, very determined to get broadband into every part of this country, reaching out across the whole of the UK, and we're convinced that we can do that. And I'm also determined that the UK should not be in any way vulnerable to a high-risk state vendors. So we'll have to think carefully about how we handle that. We'll have to come up with the right technological solutions, but also have to make sure that we continue to deliver the broadband that the UK needs.
Now, I saw one former head of MI6, the British intelligence agency, writing in the Financial Times on this, saying the UK should bar Huawei from its 5G network, and the West also needs to unite and stand firm against rising Chinese aggression. Well, here's the BBC's Helen Catt on the calculations behind this latest statement from the Prime Minister.
A lot of Conservative backbenchers, there's a fair number of those, who are still quite unhappy at the involvement of Huawei in the UK's 5G networks, in telecoms infrastructure. So much so that even with a majority of 80, there have been some nerves about whether or not Downing Street can actually get this bill through. So what's changed, though, that, as I said, that's been pretty consistent for several months. What's changed, though, is the US decision to impose sanctions on Huawei. And what that's done is to affect how it's able to manufacture its chips, its processors. And there are concerns that that may now be less safe and less secure. And that is the sort of report that we understand is sort of being considered by the government at the moment, and which could signal this sort of shift and this change. But of course, this whole thing is bound up not only in those sort of international disputes between China and the US, it's sort of getting pulled into that, but there's the political pressure here in Westminster. But of course, the other thing to remember is that if Huawei were to not be involved or have to have its kit taken out of some of the UK infrastructure, there could also be consequences on things like the delivery, or the speed of delivery of broadband. And that was a key Conservative manifesto pledge, was to roll out full fibre broadband everywhere by 2025. So there's quite a lot going on here.
Now, let me update you on the coronavirus. The US remains the epicentre of the pandemic. It now has close to 3 million confirmed cases, and more than 52,000 new infections were reported just on Sunday. Florida is one area of concern. The infection rate is escalating, and total infections are now past 200,000. 11,000 of them were reported on Sunday. Bear in mind, there were July the 4th celebrations at the weekend, but this beach in Miami, which would normally be packed, was shut. A citywide curfew was also in place. And this is one of the reasons Florida is taking the threat so seriously. Another stark statistic is that its infections rose by 168% in June. Its daily infection rate is above any recorded by a European country at the height of the pandemic. So Florida is right in the middle of this. So is Texas. Cases there have now passed 200,000, and more than 8,000 people were hospitalised on Sunday. According to local media, hospitals may reach capacity within 2 weeks. And there's an ongoing political debate about whether the state needs a stay-at-home order. Next, further west onto Arizona. Infections there are rising rapidly. They've almost reached 100,000. Gyms, bars and cinemas have all been closed until the end of the month. And more than 5,000 people were admitted to hospital on Sunday. There are also concerns in Arizona. Hospitals may reach their limits. Here's one emergency doctor.
It's absolutely terrifying. We're having whole families who end up in the hospital. We had one family with 3 members who were actually on ventilators in the ICU. And you see how it's devastating for the families, the community, and for those of us who are healthcare workers holding their hands in their moments of need. It's nothing short of devastating. It's challenging because our workspaces in the hospitals are totally full, our entire staff. And it takes an entire staff of our team, respiratory therapists and nurses, and even down to our environmental services and admin support, to really be able to take care of patients the way we typically can. And we're just not able to, both because the degree of sickness that the patients have, how much time it takes for each patient donning and doffing over and over again, and our exhausted workforce. We've been on deployment, essentially, if you will, since March, and it's simply exhausting. People are ending up with acute stress.
Well, from the US to Latin America, we'll have updates from Brazil and El Salvador. But first of all, Bolivia. Compared to some of its neighbours, it had been faring well, but unfortunately the numbers are now starting to move. Infections are past 39,000. There have been over 1,300 deaths. Also, the health ministers tested positive. The mining minister and minister of the presidency have too. Now, these escalating numbers are a particular concern because Bolivia is one of the poorest countries in Latin America. Its health system is ill-equipped to cope with the pandemic. I wanted to highlight the city of Cochabamba. It's been badly hit. Crematoriums are overwhelmed. These are workers digging makeshift graves. And this upsetting footage illustrates the pressure on Bolivia's resources. This coffin holds the body of a 62-year-old who died from COVID-19. It was left on the street for hours because cemeteries had to close their doors. Well, next we turn to El Salvador. The chief of the cabinet is on the left here, Mario Duran. In the past 24 hours, he's tested positive for the virus. The government has imposed some of the toughest measures in Latin America, and that's been effective, keeping cases below 8,000. A further reopening of the economy, though, has been delayed by 2 weeks. As I'm sure you know, Brazil is the epicenter of the pandemic in Latin America. It has over 1.6 million cases and over 64,000 deaths. Some experts actually think Brazil is on track to become the country with the highest death toll by late July. And this New York Times graphic shows that Sao Paulo is the worst affected state. It alone has more than 320,000 infections. But even as the crisis worsens, the city of Sao Paulo is very much getting back to business. In the last few hours, hair salons, bars and restaurants have all reopened. So given these numbers, what's the case for that kind of reopening? Here's the BBC's correspondent in Sao Paulo, Katie Watson.
Well, simply that they think that they can cope. I mean, if you take the example of Sao Paulo, it's one of the wealthiest states. It's the wealthiest state, in Brazil. They've looked at issues such as occupation of intensive care beds, the death toll, and they've labelled across the state. They've labelled municipalities in a series of 5 phases. So if you hit a certain phase, and you can reopen. If the situation gets worse, and they have to go back to closing. So here in Sao Paulo City, they have been able to reopen. In fact, I've just taken a walk around the block, and for the last 3 months, there've been restaurants and beauty salons absolutely closed. It's been dead. But just walking around in a space of a couple of blocks, there are several restaurants all getting ready, reopening, and it feels much more alive. But of course, many experts are saying this is coming at completely the wrong time.
And those businesses which are opening, presumably they're having to follow a range of rules.
Absolutely. So one I walked by, you could see there were yellow arrows that had been painted on the floor to show which way you needed to walk to collect your food in a restaurant. I saw several restaurants with hand sanitizer waiting there. So people obviously have to use that when they come in the restaurants, and distance tables as well. So those are the measures that they're putting in. But of course, a few days ago, Rio reopened its bars and restaurants, and there were images and videos coming out showing people absolutely packed into these bars, not wearing masks, as is mandatory across much of Brazil. So that's the concern, that people are now, desperate to get back to some kind of normality. Yet we're still very far from that sense of that normality here in Brazil, with the death toll still rising.
Thanks to Katie. Through the programme, we'll be updating you on the pandemic. We're also going to look at the issue of postal voting in the US. It may sound like a dry subject, but it's becoming a controversial political issue. We'll explain why. The British government has announced emergency funding for theatres, galleries and museums. Will Gompertz has more.
Theatres, music venues, cinemas and museums across the country have been brought to their knees by the COVID-19 pandemic, with many saying they'll be bankrupt within weeks without emergency government support. That arrived today, with Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, announcing a £1.57 billion rescue package for the culture and heritage sector. The announcement has been warmly welcomed by many arts leaders, who say they can now see a way for their organisations to survive, at least until the spring. Of the total amount, £270 million will be made available as loans, with the rest, the vast majority, coming in the form of grants. There are likely to be many winners, but the money has come too late for some venues, which have already been forced to close, while others only just clinging on to the hope of a post-pandemic return. Will Gompertz, BBC News.
I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source. We're here as usual in the BBC newsroom. Our lead story concerns China. It's warning the UK over interference in Hong Kong and over fresh questions about Huawei's role in UK telecoms. Now, let me take you through some of the other stories we've been looking at as well. China says it's reaching an understanding with India to ease border tensions and disengage frontline troops along the disputed frontier. The decision follows talks on Sunday. However, China is also saying it will continue to safeguard its territorial sovereignty. That's from BBC Chinese. The new president of Malawi says he'll end corruption and donor dependency because they undermine taxes and dignity. Lazarus Chakwera delivered his inauguration speech 2 weeks after winning a rerun of last year's election. He says too many administrations have promised good governance but delivered poverty. That's from BBC Africa. Ghislaine Maxwell, the ex-girlfriend of the disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein, has been moved to a prison in New York. She's facing 6 charges, among them recruiting and grooming girls for Mr. Epstein. That's from BBC World Service in English. Now, let's continue to bring you coronavirus updates from around the world. Next, we turn to India. It now has close to 700,000 confirmed cases. That's the 3rd highest total after America and Brazil. It's recorded more than 24,000 new infections just in the last 24 hours, and its death toll is over 19,000. Here's Yogita Lamai in Mumbai.
Indian authorities have been repeatedly pointing out that even though the number of cases on the whole are rising, the mortality rate in India seems to be lower than other countries with a comparable number of cases. But over the past many weeks, we've spoken to frontline doctors who say that COVID deaths are not being properly counted. Sometimes, the comorbidity that a person might have is listed on the death certificate rather than COVID-19. In some places, they've told us that people who were brought in dead, even if they have COVID-like symptoms, are not tested, and therefore they're not counted among COVID deaths. And finally, of course, even before coronavirus hit India, the system of recording deaths sometimes, is much delayed. And therefore, there are worries that the number of deaths could actually be far lower than the actual mortality that we've seen in India because of coronavirus.
From India to Israel, it's reimposed some restrictions after a spike in infections. Bars, gyms and event halls have now been closed, and this is why. This shows the numbers of new cases in Israel since lockdown was eased just over a month ago, and you can see that marked here, and the number of cases steadily climbing since then. These are the latest pictures from the intensive care unit in the country's largest hospital, just close to Tel Aviv. Well, we're looking at the impact of COVID-19 in a range of countries around the world. Next to Australia and an extraordinary state of affairs, the border between Victoria and New South Wales is being closed for the first time since the Spanish flu pandemic, and that was over a century ago. That's because of what's happening in Victoria's capital, Melbourne. Australia's national numbers remain low, very low, frankly, compared with many other countries. 106 people have died. There have been around 8,500 cases. But on Monday, there were 127 new infections recorded in Victoria. That's the highest daily total since the pandemic began in Australia. 9 public housing estates in Melbourne now appear to be the focus. They're under a 5-day lockdown after a cluster of cases was found. This means around 3,000 people being told to stay in their homes. And some of them are saying the government's been slow to provide essential supplies and information. Here's more on that from ABC's Elias Klur.
The latest outbreaks have come from the council flats in the working class areas of Melbourne's inner northwest. Now, the government said as of Sunday that 30 cases had come from several households at these residences, and effective immediately it shut down those 9 apartment buildings encompassing 3,000 residents. Now, these residents had no notice that they would be locked inside their homes. They also had no notice that 500 police officers would be roaming the halls of these buildings. That's effectively 1 officer to every 6 residents. Now, I spoke to some people living in these buildings who say the food they've been provided by the government is insufficient, saying things like they've been given cereal with no milk, jam, a tin of tuna just to feed 10 people in a household. They say they're being treated like prisoners. They've also said that it's racist. If this was happening in a more affluent part of Melbourne, police of this kind of magnitude would not be deployed. Now, the government and the Premier of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, has pledged to offer more support, but the people living here just want these draconian measures eased. The government says they'll be in place for 5 days as they attempt to get the virus under control.
Also wanted to show you this sign in a window in one of the tower blocks. As you can see, it reads, "Treat us as humans, not caged animals." And here is one of the residents.
I heard sirens outside, and when I looked down, there was about 50 police cars just parked under our building, closing all the streets and every entrance and exit. When there's that much police presence, you begin to feel like you did something wrong. So it wasn't a safe feeling. There was no health representatives present at the time. People believe that these buildings are full of immigrants and people that just lower class, and they don't treat them as normal citizens.
To Europe next. As you'll know, for a time it was the epicenter of the pandemic. Now it's slowly reopening. Here's just one example. The Louvre in Paris is back in business, albeit with limited visitor numbers, compulsory face masks, and you have to book online in advance. Nonetheless, it's a big moment, not just for the museum, but for Paris as a tourist destination. Here's Hugh Schofield.
The tourists are still not back in France, so for now this is a treat mainly for Parisians. A Louvre with perhaps a fifth of its regular customers, making enjoyment of the treasures here not a scramble, but as it should be, a pleasure.
So for the next couple of months at least, a chance to see the Mona Lisa like you've never seen her before, in scenes of relative tranquility. If you've been here before in normal times, you'll know exactly what I mean.
The health rules in place keep people moving mainly in the same direction, but because numbers are much lower than normal, there's no regimentation. It's perfectly possible to stop and enjoy.
It's great. I've been enjoying a lot. It's a pleasure.
How long will the new system last? No one knows. It depends on COVID and also on money. The Louvre's been losing millions. But if you're someone who's concerned about how crowds can ruin art, now's the time to go. Hugh Schofield, BBC News, Paris.
Now, one of the world's most influential film composers, Ennio Morricone, has died at the age of 91. He composed memorable scores to hundreds of films, including this. As you can see in here, that was the theme to the spaghetti western The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, starring Clint Eastwood. He continued working until just a few years ago and became the oldest person ever to win a competitive Oscar for his score for Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight. Well, let's go to New York now to talk to the Canadian composer Howard Shore, who won 3 Academy Awards, 4 Grammy Awards, 2 Golden Globes for his scores for The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit series. He also wrote the music for many other major films, including The Silence of the Lambs and Gangs of New York. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. We appreciate you joining us. How do you begin to assess the legacy of this extraordinary man?
Well, it's a very sad day. We've lost a master, one of the great composers to write music, not just for the cinema, but for the concert stage as well.
And why was he a master?
He just embodied this spirit of music that was so influential to so many other composers and to the audience. He thrilled people the world over with his work.
And can you explain to us the particular skill of writing music for a film?
Well, it starts with the words for me and with the stories we're telling, and to have good collaboration with all the filmmaking artists that work on films. Now, with the composer, to have a very special relationship with the director, as Ennio did with Sergio Leone, which had great trust in him, and that's what produced some of those great, original, amazing scores.
Well, you mentioned those scores. It can be quite hard to whittle them down to a favourite, a particular moment that works for you as a viewer and as a listener. Yeah. But what would you select? Was there one moment where you thought, my goodness, this man has mastered what he's trying to do?
Well, he's written hundreds of scores that are just unbelievable, and I urge everyone to listen to his great works and his works that might be a little more obscure. But favorites for me that are very emotional, of course, are The Mission, which is an incredible score, and scores like Cinema Paradiso, The Untouchables, also very, very moving, great music for the cinema.
And when you think of the lessons that he's taught you as a composer and also many others who write film scores, what would you pick out as being the lesson that you take with you as you go about your work?
He was very inspiring to composers. And for me, it was speak from your heart, be individual, and create music that comes from your heart, from your soul.
Well, Howard Shore, thank you very much indeed. There's Howard Shore, one master of the skill of writing film scores, talking about another Ennio Morricone who's died at the age of 91. And if you'd like to see more on his quite extraordinary career, you can find that through the BBC News website. Just go to the front page, hit Entertainment and Arts, and you'll see an obituary there. I'll see you in a couple of minutes' time.
Hello there. Through the afternoon we had quite a few showers across the north and east of the UK, but the northwest of England had a fine afternoon with sunshine. I'm told you pronounce this Broomcastle. It's near Penrith in Cumbria. Sunny skies here. It was quite a blustery day. Well, you can see the extent of the sunshine working in on the satellite picture, but that is shower cloud across eastern England, northern Scotland as well. And zooming out on this satellite picture, these next areas of cloud just to our west will be bringing outbreaks of rain to different parts of the UK Tuesday and Wednesday. And further afield, this blob of cloud is Tropical Storm Edward. The remnants of this will bring some rain across the UK on Thursday. So there's no sign of our weather settling down just yet. And overnight, showers will continue to feed in across northern and western Scotland. Dry for a time across England and Wales with some clear spells. Clear for a time in Northern Ireland, but thicker cloud by the end of the night. Outbreaks of rain knocking on the door. That rain is associated with that first blob of cloud I showed you on the satellite picture a moment ago. Is this area of low pressure that's going to be steaming in quickly during Tuesday morning. So a wet start to the morning quite quickly in Northern Ireland. The rain spreads in, becomes persistent and heavy. Might be quite a nice sunrise in northern England before the thicker cloud edges in and we get the persistent rain coming in through the afternoon and turning wet through the day across parts of Wales and across parts of the Midlands. Southern England, the far south of Wales, a lot of cloud, feeling quite humid, maybe a few hill fog patches. To the north, sunshine and showers in Scotland. Some of those showers heavy, even with a rumble of thunder. Now by Wednesday, the area of rain will have rippled southwards, affecting southern parts of England and Wales, where it will kind of come and go in bursts, really. Further north, we've got the fresher air. Again, bright skies, bit of sunshine and a few slow-moving showers, feeling humid in the south, but still fresher air further north. It's on Thursday that the remains of what is left over from Tropical Storm Edward get tied up within this weather front. It's going to be bringing some very humid air to southern parts of the country, and there'll be some rain around as well. But there's uncertainty where this rain band's going. Yes, it could be running across these areas, or it could be much further north, heading into Northern Ireland, Northern England, southern Scotland. We're not quite sure just yet, but it will be humid across southern areas, the fresher air further north, with arguably a more pleasant feel to the weather. That's your latest forecast.
Listen up, everybody. Friday nights are moving and grooving to a different beat. I'm gonna dig deep into the rhythms of Brazil, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Huey Morgan's Latin Music Adventure continues Friday at 9:30 on BBC 4 and iPlayer.
I'm here at this hospital where they're already experiencing the benefits of AI.
This is seriously cutting-edge technology.
Wouldn't it be good if firefighters could use technology to see what they're getting themselves into?
This is a very innovative project to protect the environment.
It's called the Artificial Tree.
You have to give them credit for blazing the trail.
A new tool to reboot democracy and find common ground amongst the most polarised of views.
Encrypted messaging apps to avoid interception from the police.
One thing that we know you will see is the expansion of the internet off the planet.
The Take on Tech. Click. Saturday and Sunday at 12:30 on the BBC News Channel.
Hello, I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source. Our lead story concerns China. It's warning the UK over interference in Hong Kong and over questions about Huawei's role in UK telecoms.
If you want to make China a hostile country, you have to bear the consequences.
And we're going to look at why President Trump keeps talking about postal voting and why this is rapidly becoming a major political issue in election year in the US. Well, as I was just mentioning, we're going to take a detailed look at why the seemingly dry issue of postal voting has become a major political issue in America. The presidential election's in November, and COVID-19 means voting is going to take a lot longer at polling booths. So a lot of states are looking at expanding postal voting, and the president doesn't like it.
I think that mail-in voting is a terrible thing. I think if you vote, you should go. Mail-in ballots are very dangerous. There's tremendous fraud involved and tremendous illegality. They want to send out thousands and thousands of ballots, and then they're going to send them back. Who knows who signed the ballot? Is anybody standing there acknowledging, oh, that was Mr. Smith? This will be, in my opinion, the most corrupt election in the history of our country, and we cannot let this happen.
Now, of course, just because Donald Trump keeps saying something repeatedly doesn't make it true. There's no evidence of widespread fraud in postal voting, and we'll get into more detail on that in a moment. But first of all, here's some background on postal voting in the US. 4 years ago, about a quarter of ballots were posted, and the rate very much varies state to state. In some, you have to go to the polling station unless you have a valid excuse. Being over 65 is considered one, living away from home is two. Then around half the states allow any registered voter to vote by post. And then you have 11 other states where you have to vote by post, and that number's actually doubled because of the pandemic. So postal voting is on the rise, and we're expecting states to further ease restrictions on it as we head towards the election in November. Now, like a lot of things in the US, this follows the political divide. In this case, Democrats are keen, Republicans definitely are not. And understanding the reasons why can tell us plenty about the election. Well, as we heard, President Trump thinks postal voting results in fraud. The Republican Party is pushing that message too. For example, in adverts like this one.
Are you tired of driving all the way to a polling location to vote? Sick of always having to remember your ID to get a ballot? Worry no more, because the fix is in. Introducing Ballot Harvest. Get fresh ballots delivered right to your door. Make your voice heard as many times as you want. We've rigged up our system to churn out ballots for every living thing in the country. Millions a day.
Well, people who study elections say it's simply not the case that fraud is common in postal voting. There are some individual stories. In New Jersey, its municipal elections in May were postal only because of the pandemic. Since then, 2 Democratic councilmen have been charged with fraud for allegedly approaching voters and collecting their ballots. And that was connected to the discovery of hundreds of ballots in one mailbox in the city of Paterson. Further south, 2 years ago, a congressional election had to be rerun after the Republican campaign seemingly broke the law. A campaign consultant faces criminal charges relating to allegations that he hired people to collect postal ballots and fill them in. Well, Mark Harris was the Republican candidate in this case. He had been in the lead by 900 votes, but the result was annulled. At the election board hearing, he agreed with that.
I believe a new election should be called. It's become clear to me that the public's confidence in the 9th District seat general election has been undermined to an extent that a new election is warranted.
Well, here's more on the issue in the US from Lorna Atkinson at the University of New Mexico.
It's very hard to find fraud. I think there's very little fraud, but where we do find it, it is systematic, and it's meant to overturn elections. What I'm most concerned about in this election is the perception of fraud and how that might lead to feelings of delegitimacy of people's votes, or a feeling that the election outcome itself is in jeopardy, that maybe it's not honest. If people don't feel that the election is free and fair, then the whole enterprise of democracy becomes a lot more difficult.
Now, one of President Trump's tweets prompted Twitter to do something it hadn't done to him before. It fact-checked it and put a warning sign saying the claims were unsubstantiated. So if the president's claim about widespread fraud is false, why does he keep making it? Well, this may explain it. President Trump thinks postal voting proposals will help the Democrats. On Fox News in March, he said they had levels of voting that if you'd ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again. And there's this interview President Trump gave to Politico in which he said mail-in voting could cost him re-election and that the biggest risk was losing the legal challenges his campaign has against postal voting. Now, to be clear, what the president's saying about increased turnout hurting Republicans is received wisdom in American politics. But the reality looks like it's actually more complex. Here's Lonna Atkinson again.
There's no evidence that we see that, Utah, for example, and Arizona are states that are vote by mail states and they're Republican states. And then you have, the coast, California, Oregon, and Washington, which are blue states. And they're also either vote by mail or high vote by mail states. And so we don't see that it per se helps one party or the other. And so, it helps whatever party is biggest in your state.
There's certainly concern among Republicans that if this election is close, postal votes may tip the balance against them. Mirka Mosbacher is on the Trump National Advisory Board.
While there has not been widespread fraud, it's usually about 1%. According to this institution technology study, for example, the part of the issue is that in a close election, such as in 2000, remember the Florida recount? When it's a close election and you have this potential for individuals to take advantage of the system, it can make a big difference.
Well, Republicans have already tried to strike down postal voting in some states before the election. If things go against President Trump in November, another option is to try and do so after the vote. His critics allege that by casting doubt on the process now, the president may be laying the ground to challenge the results later in the courts. His challenger, Joe Biden, says it's my greatest concern that this president is going to try and steal this election. Let's be clear, President Trump says if he loses, he'll leave office quietly, but some are still worrying he won't. Peter Nicholas is a reporter with The Atlantic. He asks here, would the president honour the peaceful transfer of power if it meant admitting failure? Anthony Scaramucci was White House communications director, albeit just for a few days. He's since become a fierce opponent of the president.
So I'm actually the contrarian on that. I think if he loses, he leaves. There's other people that think he doesn't lose. He'll stay. Newsweek just put out an article by two very smart guys talking about how he could use some of the aggressive executive powers to keep himself in the presidency. I don't think the American military would stand for that. I think he has the worst relationship as commander-in-chief in modern history with the American military. So I think they will eject him like an Austin Powers villain from the White House if he loses, whether it's narrowly. He's not going to lose narrowly. He's going to get wiped out.
Well, what everyone can agree on is that the outcome should be peaceful. We saw some ugly scenes back in 2016 after the last election. There were riots in Portland and in other places after Hillary Clinton lost. This time around, there are concerns again about how some of President Trump's supporters may react if he were to lose. This heavily armed biker gang was filmed patrolling outside the recent Trump rally in Tulsa. They call themselves the Cowboy Militia, and they said they were there to protect free speech. Elsewhere in the country, other militia groups have threatened violence if, as they see it, President Trump is cheated out of office. Well, any number of issues to work through. Anthony Zerka is live with us from Washington. Anthony, first of all, given this is a federal election, why is there not a standardized approach to postal voting across the US?
The bottom line is that's the way the Constitution set it up. There's an elections clause in the Constitution that says states have the grounds to regulate the time, place, and manner of elections. Now, Congress and the federal government can step in and supersede state laws, but when the states get the first crack at it, essentially. So there have been times with civil rights laws and the Department of Motor Vehicle Registration that Congress has given guidelines states have to respect, but when push comes to shove, it's the states that get the first crack.
Now, clearly, Anthony, it's in the interests of Donald Trump's opponents to present him as someone who might not accept the transfer of power. But when you look at what has actually happened, either from Donald Trump or his supporters, is there really any evidence this is something that people should be concerned about?
There's not a whole lot of evidence. I mean, I heard the same sort of thing 4 years ago in October of 2016 among, some Donald Trump supporters who said that they weren't going to accept the results of the election if he lost to Hillary Clinton. But I mean, that was just, I think, the emotions running high at the time. And the Constitution sets a timeline for when a president's term ends. It's in January of the year following the election, and it would be very difficult outside of these fairly creative hypotheses that some people are advancing that Donald Trump would be able to stay in if he loses the election.
All right, Anthony, we'll leave it there. So we may be in a situation where making these kind of questions and allegations may suit Donald Trump's opponents. It may also suit him to suggest that in some way he's up against the system. Of course, the election is in early November. Now, stay with us here on Outside Source. In a few minutes, we're going to turn to Turkmenistan. We don't do that very often. It's the world's most secretive state, and it's allowed the World Health Organization in because of COVID-19. People in Scotland have been able to have a drink in a beer garden and eat at a pavement cafe after they opened for the first time in 15 weeks. Here's Sarah Smith.
Spraying disinfectant, wearing PPE wasn't previously in a barman's job description. After 15 long, dry weeks, pubs in Scotland can now open as long as everyone's drinking outside.
Yeah, we're really excited for the customers to get in and use it. It'll be a big benefit to the business, especially in the good weather. If the sun's shining, we're expecting some good crowds in here.
It may not quite be normal, but it's very welcome.
Beautiful day, first time out, lovely pint of beer, magnificent.
Oh, it's great to come out and see other people and people watch and socialise.
Bars and restaurants will be allowed to welcome customers indoors from the 15th of July. The First Minister says the 2-metre rule will be relaxed if additional safety measures like Perspex screens are in place, but it could be difficult to enforce.
Whether you're going to a shop or coming to a beer garden, is if the staff there are asking you to behave in a way that is not normal, they're doing it for your protection, so you must not be narky with them or show them any intolerance or abuse.
Opinion polls suggest voters believe Nicola Sturgeon has handled this crisis much better than Boris Johnson, and that support for Scottish independence is increasing to unprecedented levels. The First Minister is confident that the rate of coronavirus in Scotland is now 5 times lower than in the rest of the UK. She says that shows it's right to move slowly and cautiously out of lockdown. Visitors are being encouraged back to outdoor attractions, like the gardens at Falkland Palace in Fife. The tourist sector desperately needs them, but the Scottish Government hasn't ruled out imposing a quarantine for people from other parts of the UK if infection levels rise. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Glasgow.
I'm on Seconds with Outside Source. We're here in the BBC newsroom. China has warned the UK over interference in Hong Kong and over questions about Huawei's role in UK telecoms. Now, let's turn to Turkmenistan. It's one of the most secretive and insular countries in the world, but it's now letting World Health Organization experts come in. Officially, Turkmenistan is coronavirus-free. In reality, that's highly unlikely. There are high case numbers in all of its neighbours, including Iran and Afghanistan, and independent media reports that there's a surge in cases of acute pneumonia, something that can be connected to COVID-19. Well, the BBC's Rehan Dimitri has more on the situation there.
There are no reports about coronavirus in Turkmenistan because officially it doesn't exist here. The only information about healthcare is what gets shown on state television, like the opening of this hospital by the president's son. Now the World Health Organization will get a chance to assess whether the country is really coronavirus-free. After weeks of waiting, a team of medical experts has finally been allowed into the country.
Yes, we would have
very much like to have gone earlier. So indeed, end of May was when we initially talked about going, and when we had the initial discussions with the government of Turkmenistan and the invitation to travel there. However, the logistics issues have been the main issue hampering our movement.
Turkmenistan closed its borders back in February and quarantined people entering the country. But independent information about how effective these measures have been is limited. This mobile footage shows cramped and unsanitary living conditions inside quarantine tents.
More and more independent news sources report of these cases of death of people of death, and cases when the whole hospitals are being closed for quarantine, with people and with doctors inside the hospitals.
And a quick reminder that you can see clips from Outside Source on the BBC News YouTube channel, which contains all of our coverage of the coronavirus, as well as lots else besides. That is it for this edition of the programme. Thank you very much indeed for watching. We'll see you tomorrow at the usual time. Bye-bye.